700 million. That many people are living on less than $2 a day in extreme poverty, often undernourished without access to basic services like electricity and safe drinking water. Even in wealthy countries and prosperous cities, there are places where people feel like they're barely making it. It's harder to get a well-paying job, afford a comfortable home, struggle to provide for their kids. Those who live in places of deep poverty often feel trapped, ashamed, and overlooked. Many are living in fear of an abuser, wrestling with an addiction afflicted by trauma, suffering from mental health disorders, constantly feeling insecure and unsafe. In remote rural villages in Guatemala and busy inner city neighborhoods in Detroit, tribal communities in the Philippines and central city slums in Nairobi. These are the hard places. But for those who live there, it's simply home, a place of rich culture and laughter and resilience, where people look out for each other, work long hours, and are doing their best just to make it through the day. But one thing you'll struggle to find in these places is a healthy, gospel-centered, thriving local church. Where there are churches in poor communities, they're often preaching a false gospel or no gospel at all. Theological wolves are left to prey on the poor, peddling a dead theology of prosperity and works. You'll hear the prayer calls of the mosque before you hear the clear call of the gospel being preached. Have we abandoned the poor, only offering our pity rather than our lives? Poverty, violence, injustice, these are real problems, but they're the symptoms of a spiritual disease we all carry with us. But treating the symptoms is good, but without the gospel cure, the patient will ultimately die in their sin. The local church is the best mercy ministry there is. Healthy local churches led by local leaders, which make disciples, put on display the love of Christ. They care for each other. They call on people to repent and grow in godliness. A local church raises the gaze of people from their struggle to their Savior. We need the church in hard places. But when it comes to engaging the poor and reaching the unreached, we could send a missionary and fund them to go to a place where there is no church. That is critical, it's necessary. We could develop a partnership with one local church in one place. Necessary, that's critical. Or we could invest in the development of hundreds of local indigenous pastors and planters. That kind of investment will make a big impact as a generation of leaders begin to thrive and their churches begin to flourish. That is what Church in Hard Places is committed to do. But we cannot do this without you. The Church in Hard Places apprenticeship is a 2-year non-residential training delivered in regional cohorts and led by regional leaders. We teach theology, model godliness, develop pastoral competencies. We're currently training 300 church leaders in 20 regional cohorts from 35 countries, speaking 8 languages, from Zambia to Sao Paulo, Detroit to Albania. These are the Church in Hard Places generation of faithful pastors, church planters who will make disciples amongst the poor. Would you and your church join us in this global effort? Would you adopt one of our cohorts, commit to pray for them, invest in their development? Come and join us as we train them. One church adopting one cohort of church leaders will make a big impact in the world's hardest places. God loves the poor, and God deserves to be worshipped by them. We know that God is moving in such a special way as He calls on those trapped in brokenness and despair to find new life in Christ. Come and join us in experiencing what God is doing in the hard places and beyond.
I'm seeing the updates from you and all that you're doing around the world. So I really just wanted to share that with people and learn more about what you're doing. So I'm just going to jump right in here to learn more about the work of Church in Hard Places. And that is not a new name. You guys were under the Acts 29 network for years, and you've now moved to partner with Practical Shepherding in January of this year. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, so Church in Hard Places began even before we were connected to Acts 29. So Max McConnell, Mike McKinley wrote the book Church in Hard Places, and really thinking about how to encourage the church and cast vision for the church to think better about engaging the poor in their own community through church planting, church revitalization. So as we through 20 schemes, started hosting Church on Places workshops around the world. Off the back of that book, we then began getting people reaching out to ask us and asking, hey, I'm here in Detroit, or I'm here in Nairobi, or I'm here in Cape Town. Can you help me think better or think through a church planting strategy, so forth? So we recognized there was a need for a ministry that would do that. We wanted to protect 20 schemes. There's our other ministry, Church Planting in Scotland. It's just about Scotland. So we needed another platform to really have this kind of training, resourcing of those doing healthy, gospel-centered, church-based ministry in areas of deep poverty around the world. So that's what became Church Our Places. Acts 29 brought us under their wing for the first 5 years of that, from 2017. And the benefit of that was just the resources that Acts 29 allowed us to lean into to really build out what has become a very robust 2-year apprenticeship program for what we call Indigenous leaders, those leaders who do ministry in poor communities. And this year, beginning of this year, so at the end of last year, we came out of Acts 29, came under practical shepherding, just because it's a better fit for us, because Church on Places is a resourcing ministry, it's a training ministry. We're not a network. You don't join us, you don't become a Church on Places church. We want to help you, we want to resource you, equip you, come alongside you. Which is exactly what practical shepherding does. It's a resource producing and training ministry. So it's been a great fit for us this past year, and the ministry has continued to grow as a result.
And so it's 2 years of like how do you hear from a church? Like, how do they get in touch with you? You like normally, I know, I imagine there's a number of ways, but like, what's typical that somebody, are you going and finding? Are they reaching out via email, other pastors?
Typically we would do an event, like what we call a Church in Our Places workshop. We might talk about a topic, whether it's abuse, addictions, mental health, trauma. Talk about a topic that is particularly relevant to engaging deprived communities. If we do an event in a city, then often we'll then talk about the opportunity for enrolling in our apprenticeship program. So that's how we would start a cohort. Once we've started a cohort, whether it's in Nepal or Philippines or Kenya or South Africa or Brazil, once the cohort is started, it's kind of self-replicating at that point, because then the guys in the group know other guys who would benefit from the group and so forth. So, so it's largely through events in the context, and then the actual cohort, once it's begun, people get added to it pretty quickly. So right now we have 300 church planters or church revitalizers in the apprenticeship program in 8 different language groups around the world, led by a team of 18 cohort leaders. So these are regional leaders. So it's so important to us that the cohort, the training is provided by a practitioner in the region. And so that's the team that we built over these last few years.
So those local leaders are usually pastors in an area.
They're all pastors, correct.
They're all pastors. These aren't seminaries usually in doing, this is pastoral work in those areas. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's right. These are pastors in the area that we've developed a relationship with and have had a good working relationship with over time. Some of them have actually done our apprenticeship program, and then we're like, hey, would you consider becoming a cohort leader? I think you're really gifted. But most of them are men that we would already be pretty familiar with and are doing great work, but have demonstrated both their own giftedness in ministry in the deprived community in their context, whether it's Brazil or South Africa or Zambia. And then our role, my job, is to resource them, train them, resource them, and provide all they need to develop the training, the program in their country.
Yeah. And so it's 2 years of that, and you're there. You try
2
to
years,
visit.
correct.
Yeah, you try to visit. How many? Yeah.
Usually, so it's a 2-year program. Year 1 is all theological development. We don't assume that the men in the program are, many of them have just never had formal training, formal education. So year 1 is mostly theological development. We start off with what is the gospel. Some of the guys that are joining our groups are coming out of prosperity gospel. Most of them would be coming out of more kind of hyper Pentecostal prosperity gospel, word of faith movement, egalitarian. And so we want to start with clear understanding the gospel. What is the gospel? What is the Bible? What is the the Trinity, what is the church. So we move through that pretty slowly in year one, using some reading content, monthly coaching meetings. And then year two is mostly competency based. So church planting strategy, expository preaching, raising up and developing leaders, discipleship, evangelism. Most of those skills, pastoral care, is going to be dealt with in that second year. Between those 2 years, we have an intensive, 3-day intensive that's residential, in person, in their region. Often, if I'm there, I'll be at that intensive. And the intensive is designed to be very practical. So the guys will be preaching a 20-minute sermon, and they'll be getting feedback. They'll be presenting their church planting strategy, and we'll be giving them feedback as they're presenting it. And so, if you like, it's like the capstone projects that get presented during those intensive.
Yeah. And is there any ordination that goes along with that from the pastors?
Yeah, so just no ordination, just there'll be certification. So we provide a certificate at the end of the program, completion for a lot of these guys. It's really valuable to them to get that certification at the end of the program. But obviously, we're not denominationally based or tied, so we'll have men in the group from existing denominations that would have more of the ordaining authority, or from a church that's sending them to us for training with a desire for them to go and plant a new church somewhere else.
Yeah. And you were in, like you said, the Philippines, you mentioned a little bit ago, and in Nepal. I know in June you were at the Southern Baptist Convention there. So I don't know when you sleep. I mean, I
get very little sleep.
Yeah, I see so many photos on the road. Yeah.
I think I've totally destroyed my internal body clock by bouncing from one time zone to the next. So it's a problem. It's definitely a problem. Yeah. I am on the road a lot. Typically 1 week a month, I'll be on the road visiting some of these sites. I'm never in one place long enough, so that's why I'm able to get to multiple places one trip. So this past trip, I was in Nepal, Kathmandu, meeting with just an incredible group of guys there in Kathmandu. I mean, Kathmandu is dealing with all the issues of poverty, both urban and rural, deep poverty, and all the lack that comes from that lack of access to trading and resources, the false gospels that enter into that context, radical Hindu, Buddhist culture, and a constitutional ban on proselytizing, on conversions. And so with a 5-year prison sentence, if you're charged with attempting to convert somebody from Hinduism to Christianity. So under all the pressures and the obstacles, we've got this incredible group of men who are seeking to go and plant healthy churches in slums and rural villages and inner city communities right across Nepal. And so it's great to meet them and spend time with them, teaching on preaching and church plant strategy, and just hearing from them as well about the work they're doing.
For those of us that are not familiar with that in Nepal, I had no idea that it was like you said. You didn't. I don't think you used the word illegal. It is, but you talked about it being constitutionally. They oppose conversion.
So they made an amendment to the Constitution, I believe, in 2015, to add that article in the Constitution that forbids anybody from any practice that would lead to somebody converting from the national religion, which would be Hindu Buddhism. They even though actually they consider themselves a secular republic now, that's still embedded in their constitution. And
I had no idea. So they can't have. Is there even like a state church mentality where Christians can be in what we might think of like a watered down kind of state church? They just can't at all.
It's a different form of persecution because they have freedom of religion, so you can practice Christianity. You just can't go to a Hindu and try to share the gospel with them legally. I mean, you could. So that's where it's nuanced, right? Because we believe from our theology that we don't convert. So I'm not converting anybody. I'm just giving them information. We're just sharing with them, and so that's the defense. Happily, you can do this.
It's kind of like what I dealt with as a chaplain. You might have to open the door, get them to say, I'm willing to discuss this. And then you sort of get around a lot of the problems, but that's going to be up to the interpreter.
Yep, exactly. And as to how radical the Hindu mob or the police chief or whatever who's coming against
Right.
you or the church is. So, I mean, I think it's more of a fear or a paranoia in the minds of believers, a genuine fear, but certainly a very present concern that this is always going to be hanging over them. So there's a cautiousness, but the men I was with, just incredible, gifted, godly, faithful, boldness, courage, with a deep sense of conviction to plant churches in that preach the true gospel. And so they get hit by both sides. You're getting hit by the state and the protections that it gives to the false gospel of Hinduism and Buddhism, which are the two major religions there. And then they're getting hit on the other side from the false gospel of the prosperity gospel, the word of faith movement that is creeping in, that is often creeping into areas of poverty. And so these guys are going to fight on both fronts, those two challenges.
Yeah, I came out of a prosperity gospel cult in my own experience here in near where I'm living right now. I had that, when I was in my 20s, came into a prosperity faith of a guy named Rodney Howard Brown.
Yeah.
Yep. The Holy Ghost bartender. He's still here, unfortunately, practicing in the Tampa area. But yeah, that was my church before I would say God surely converted and brought me to himself. So, I mean, I have some experience with that in an American, what you're talking about, and I see it overseas in Africa, many places. Yeah.
Yes. One of the main exports of the American church right now is the prosperity gospel.
Yeah. How about the Philippines and where you're at? Any similar Islamic?
In many ways, completely different. So in the Philippines, we were working with a particular people group called the Monyang tribal group. So the Monyang tribe is the people group that indigenous to Mindoro Island. Mindoro Island is the island just south of the mainland, which is Luzon. That's where Manila is, and most of the people live up on that northern island. The next island down is called Mindoro. The Monyang tribal group is the indigenous people of that island, but they've kind of been displaced into the jungle from the more profitable, fruitful land on the coastlands. They've been displaced by just kind of over the last 200 years. Just others moving into the island has displaced them, whether that be from Spanish colonialism, whether that be from Filipino mainlanders coming in to that island. So the Monyang tribal group is actually significantly persecuted by their own people, not because of their faith, but because of their ethnicity and because of their tribal identity. They're considered a very primitive people group, living in the middle of the jungle in bamboo huts and foraging and hunting, largely a oral culture. So we have there's a missionary that did the Church in Our Places training in Australia. He's a wonderful guy called Scott, that was sent out from Sydney to go and work amongst the Monyang tribal group there in Mindoro. And he's using the Church in High Places, the apprenticeship program, as the leadership development pipeline for the Monyang tribe that he's working with. So it was a completely different experience, because there we're trekking into the jungle, making our way back to this little very primitive bamboo hut village, but meeting with these incredible men. We had 10 men in our cohort that a meeting every week right now, going through the theological training. Right now, we're just working really slowly on theology, not even moving much beyond what is the gospel and what is the church and what is the Bible, really pressing in on there. And then the hope with these men would go on to plant healthy churches deeper into the jungle, where they will encounter Islamic militia and also communist militia that hide out in the jungle on the island. But yeah, so it's certainly an incredibly hard place in terms of extreme poverty, segregation, in terms of forced isolation as a people group, and then the challenges of living in that physical environment in the jungles of Mindoro.
I'm curious, in your experience, Matt, and where you're at. I want to ask you so many questions that we only have so long here this afternoon. So I gotta kill some of the questions I'd love to ask. Because I'd love to ask you so many, and I so love what you're doing, and there'll be other questions I have for you in the future, I hope. But I'm curious, in any of these regions where you're at, is the presence of the church there, would you say, existent because of churches that were once strong and have since floundered? Or is it really new action the Lord is doing and using? Does that make sense? Like
Yeah,
maybe
it's
Philippines versus Nepal, but
yeah, it's
yeah,
both end, isn't it? So certainly in Philippines, it's slightly different because where the church was Roman Catholic, it was settled by Spaniards in terms of the main colonial influence on the island. So the Catholic Church is considered like more of the national church in the Philippines. So even if somebody did grow up with some kind of faith, call themselves Christians, it still would have been a false gospel and a false understanding of the church.
yeah,
Nepal, the same way, there's really no long history of Christianity in Nepal. But then we're doing work. Most of our work is in Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, where obviously there is, in many ways, a very strong resurgent church planting movement, particularly in Brazil or in parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. But many of it is just sloppy. It's bad ecclesiology. It's bad theology, and often driven by well-intended but poorly thought through mission agencies and mission strategies that are chasing after the rapid as opposed to the careful. And so rapid church planting, rapid multiplication, and this kind of movement methodology. But we end up being left in the wake of that is actually really unhealthy churches led by unhealthy pastors who are just struggling. And so we're kind of in some ways coming behind that to bring in some of these guys into what is not rapid at all. 2-year intensive discipleship, mentoring, coaching, training, accountability system structure that hopefully will make them much stronger in the work they're doing. So so you see every country you go to, every region is going to have different challenges because of the history of those places.
Yeah. Hey, if you could see my notes over here, man, literally I wrote, question 3 was, what is practical shepherding maybe versus just shepherding? Is there one? Is this what it means, at least in part, to be an unhurried pastor? And then that was 3A. 3AI was, why should pastors not be in a hurry? And
there
so you've kind of answered that in it.
Just touched on it,
With that question in mind, though, like, would you elaborate just a little more? 2 years, intensive theological, practical, intensive in the middle. Why should pastors and church planners not be in a hurry?
So I think there's a difference between urgency and hurry. So we should have a sense of urgency about the task God's given us. We should be urgent in recognizing that people are going to hell, that there's communities desperately in need of gospel preaching churches that need to be reached, that there are places around the world that desperately need a bold gospel witness to move in. So there's a sense of urgency about the task. But when we act in a hurry, then we tend to lack the carefulness that we need. I think that the New Testament models for us. And so if you look at the church planting strategy in the New Testament, there was certainly a sense of urgency. So Paul enters a new community with a sense of boldness and courage and urgency. But then when he identifies that new believer, that potential leader, he slows everything down and he stays there a while. And he's training and discipling and coaching and equipping until there's raised up qualified men capable of preaching and teaching and leading faithfully this church. And then he backs away and then goes to the next place. So there is an urgency in terms of pursuing an area of lostness, spiritual darkness, but then there is a carefulness in terms of our approach to raising up and laying on hands. But part of the problem we have with the rapid multiplication and the movement methodology is actually it lays hands too quickly. It calls men pastors who are not pastors, and it calls churches that are not churches. And in the pursuit of speed and numbers and rapid, when I'd say, actually, let's be a little bit more careful before we call a man a pastor. And let's be a little bit more careful before we call a group of Christians a church. There are things that the scripture tells us that defines what an elder is, what a church is, and that it takes time for that to be established in a place. And so, it's We want to be urgent, but we want to be careful.
Yeah. And so I did some math here on some stuff, and my next question is just going to be about leaders in places. I'm thinking more in Nepal, but wherever, and all the work you're doing. And our church in Florida here is heavily involved in missions in Brazil, in other. Right now, the church is in Kenya, but
Yep.
I think we hit 26 countries last year
Amazing.
with some sort of short-term mission trip. So there's a lot of short-term missions, but sponsoring missionaries. Our conference is actually coming up in 2 weeks, early October, where we're bringing, I think, 29 missionaries, which is about
Wonderful.
somewhere between half and a third of what we sponsor worldwide to Florida to learn about and interact with and let our members meet and all of that we're involved with. So, I'm thinking more on the Nepal side. How many of the pastors that you work with would ever expect, Matt, to make their living on the gospel? To be able to.
Great question. Yeah, great question. So I would say most of the men in our cohorts would not be in that position. Most would be living in a culture and an environment where they have to have some source of income in addition to what the church is able to provide them. And that source of income is going to come either from their local church or a partner that's helping them, and some either trade or business or skill that they've developed over time. And I think that's, so in many ways, in some communities that's not sustainable. You got to have a full-time pastor that's present and active for the church to be fruitful in the context. In most of the areas that we're working with, in areas of deep poverty, actually, the ability to have a source of income outside of the church is, number one, critical, because the members of the churches aren't going to have the income level, even were they to be fully sacrificially, faithfully giving, to provide a living wage for a pastor and his family. So there has to be some form of alternative income. But sometimes that alternative actually keeps them in the community, whether it's a store they run or a school they teach at, or some other trade that they operate. Actually, it's an opportunity for them to engage in the community themselves. So it becomes itself a ministry opportunity for them. I don't think there's enough really. So you hear a lot about business as missions. So missionaries thinking about business models and business platforms to gain access to certain contexts. I think I'd love to explore more about what it looks like to, particularly in these kind of areas of deep poverty. I'm talking about places where people make $2.50 a day, $3 a day. So kind of areas of deep poverty, slums, rural villages around the world, or these tribal communities.
Yeah.
Many of them are just living day to day because that's the life, but that's normal life in many ways. It's life for everybody in their community, not just life for the pastor. So they're living day to day, trying to make it through the day, a very fragile kind of economy and fragile existence as they do that. But there does need to be some more thought to how do we develop some skills, and how do we provide some training and potentially some capital to help pastors develop those kind of skills that would allow them to have a source of income where they're not fully 100% dependent on the church. But doing that without removing the responsibility of the local church to provide for the pastor. So it's not either or, it's both and.
A problem that there's no easy solution to, and most of us have not had any experience trying to solve. And I've done some teaching online in Pakistan for a year, for example, and we were able to send money via Western Union to pastors in the area. We did some fundraising, bought food and Bibles and disaster relief and a couple of initiatives there. To most of the places you work with, is that even possibility? Is that even a possibility for people to be sending money via some medium to a pastor in Nepal or the Philippines? Or I'd imagine South America, yes, more often, but
most places there's the ways. It's just not the same place everywhere. It's not the same way every place. So what works in Pakistan may not work in India, that may not work in Brazil. So there's different rules, different legislation. You got to be careful. Even sending money from the US to certain countries, you got to look at that. We're really careful. We don't send money directly to pastors. We will send a grant to our cohort leaders. So our cohort leader in Nepal, our cohort leader in Zambia, our cohort leader in South Africa will receive a grant, and that will go to him directly personally, but that will be for the purpose of carrying out the ministry.
Yeah.
Whether it's training the cohort, traveling, he's going to need to travel from place to place. He may take from that a small stipend, but for the most part, he's using it to fund the ministry on the ground.
Yeah.
We typically we want the men in the cohort to be thinking less about, hey, I might get some financial support at the end of this. Actually, we make it quite clear you won't get any financial support at the end of this, but you will get something that's very valuable, which is the training, a library of books. So they each get 24 books plus the friendship and the relationships you're developing, and it could potentially lead to partnerships down the road with other churches as your church develops and grows, and you begin to develop some connection around the world as you do that. And so, it's no easy solution to that.
Yeah, no, but that's insightful right there. How the work that you do, which undoubtedly raises some funds to help with the books and the material and the cohort training and the travel and all that you do, how that can be supported. So I did some math here, and I'm looking at our time. So forgive me for kind of moving on, man. Again, I'd love to have you on again and pick your brain on this, because I serve in a church that is in one of the wealthier areas in Florida. Just a different dynamic, same gospel, different dynamic. And I wanted to try to bring to light some of these things that most of us don't think about, that you are, where the Lord has you thinking about quite a bit. So I did some math here. Bear with me for a moment. $1 to anybody watching this, and you think about how wealthy you are as a American, and what you might be able to do with that money. This is a brief. I want to talk about this. It's very convicting for me. $1 is worth 134.31 Nepalese rupee right now, and the conversions will change a little. So $3,000 is 402,933 Nepalese rupee, or NR. For expenses, a family of four's estimated annual income needed near Kathmandu is 2,189,102 NR. That is 16,298 roughly dollars US. The average annual rent for a 3-bedroom apartment inside the city of Kathmandu, whoever's gathering this info, is about a little over 600,000 NR per year, or a little over 4,500 US. So bottom line is I did some math and looked into this. An annual income needed for a family of 3 or 4 to live in the heart of one of the busier cities in Kathmandu in Nepal would be about a little under 21,000 US dollars a year, or about $1,734 a month. That's for rent and living inside a major city. So 2.5 thousand US dollars per month then is far more than is needed for an annual family income in or near a large city like Nepal. And this is the last bit of the math here. If 4 different families in our churches, let's say, were to agree to help a cohort leader, to help your ministry, to do what you're doing, it'd be about $52 a month. And you didn't come on here to do any fundraising, so bear with me.
We'll take it though.
Well, again, I just want everybody watching this to know that Matt did not say, "Hey, would you put together some numbers?" It's just something I'm doing and I'm thinking about, because it's convicting for me. What maybe the Lord makes us a blessing to bless others to do, and what we can do. So let's say we gave about $52 a month. A family, a group of 4 families in the U.S. doing that amount of money could provide annually the entire salary to live rather well. We're not talking about prosperity gospel here. We're talking about living and serving, being free to serve the Lord more in ministry. It kind of puts it in perspective. That's
incredibly insightful, but it is, so you have resource wealthy context and resource poor context. And just about every church in America is resource wealthy, comparatively. And so we got buildings, we have access to training, we have access to books, and so we have resources. And every new person that joins our church increases the resource bank that's available to that church. By virtue of that person has gifts and talents, but also treasures that they can provide and share with the church. So we live in a resource wealthy context. That doesn't mean that there aren't communities across North America that are poor, but even I think the poorest places in North America still have access to resources that many places in the world do not have access to.
Even if you had money,
even if you have money.
Yeah.
But then you have the resource poor context. And so whether that's this tribal group the Hmong people group in the Philippines, or pastors living in slums in Kathmandu, or a pastor in a rural village in Kenya, you got resource poor context where you have lack of access to education, to facilities, to training, to finances, to the resource wealth. And I do think there is a biblical imperative that the resource wealthy are called to support those that are resource poor. So you think of Paul, his final journey, when he's leaving, he heads out of Miletus, he's heading back to Jerusalem, and he's collecting an offering from the churches, because the people back in Jerusalem were starving. They were struggling. There was a financial need. Because of persecution in many ways, but also because of natural issues, natural disasters and so forth. So there's a very real need. And so Paul took it upon himself to challenge the church and say, it is your responsibility to respond to the need that is present in this church, even though that church is bigger. It's the mothership, the church in Jerusalem, in many ways, in terms of it's older, it's more established. So if we take that principle, then there should be a responsibility we have as resource wealthy Christians and resource wealthy churches to think about how we're investing the resources that God has given us stewardship over to be a blessing to the resource poor Christian world, whether that is supporting a pastor or training of a church planter or providing whether it's books or anything for those in the resource poor world, but doing it not from a position of paternalistic or authoritarian control, which is often what we see is, right? We see that with money comes control, or with money comes this kind of us and them authority structure. Now, yes, there should be, again, stewardship. We've got to be wise stewards. But when when a church gives a donation to another church or to an individual, you are not an authority over them. You are a partner with them, and they are actually your equal. Biblically speaking, a church is any church, no matter where in the world it is, stands as equal alongside any other church under Christ, under the headship of Christ. And so it's recognizing that as well. I mean, it's a huge issue that we have, that we need resource wealth division. It's not just about, I feel like, so just some other metrics and numbers to think about. How much does it cost to send one missionary from here to Nepal? I'd say probably $100,000 minimum, $100,000 to send a missionary, a Western missionary, to Nepal. And in some contexts, it's valuable, and it's definitely necessary to send Western missionaries in pioneer ministry context where there are no believers. So send those missionaries for $100,000. Or you can support one pastor, say $20,000. We're going to support this one guy, $20,000. He's going to be faithful to pastor his church and to shepherd his church. What the Church in Our Places piece, what we're offering, though, is catalyzing healthy church planting in a region through training of indigenous leaders led by one indigenous pastor. And so for $12,000, you can actually invest in one cohort of 12 men for 2 years that they're going to provide resources to the training and the support and the friendship and the mentorship they get. And now you've impacted 12.
Is that the metric you usually help your supporters understand?
Yeah, it's typically $1,000 per year per apprentice. So an apprentice is one of our trainees that is in one of our cohorts.
Okay,
so that's the investment that we're making in the training of that guy, whether it's that meeting or the intensive that they attend or the cohort leader that we're providing for him. So, but now think about impact. So, $12,000 in this cohort of indigenous leaders results in 12 healthy churches preaching the true gospel in some of the hardest places in Nepal, compared to $100,000 in one missionary that is doing that work. So I'm not pitting them against each other. I'm not saying this is good, that's bad. I'm saying these are all good. These are all good. But sometimes we don't even consider that third option. How do we develop indigeneity in a context by raising up trusted indigenous leaders to provide and resourcing them to provide training in their community? And that's what Church Our Place is seeking to be.
And so again, that's maybe a clear difference between a church planter, which you're not really doing, and you're more focused on educating, equipping, resourcing pastors.
So we're equipping indigenous leaders to plant churches or to faithfully shepherd and revitalize them.
Yeah. Well, again, I just want to be clear that I went through some of those numbers, and that's I wanted to hear from you on, but that was not, my intent to have you on. So the folks that'll watch this, that I pray, I'm going to put a link in the description where they can find Church in Hard Places and pray about this. I wanted them to think how much, literally, I'm going to pay more for pest control this month in my home, which is a necessity here in Florida. If you don't, you're going to be sleeping with the critters. But I'm going to pay more for that than I would to support the work of the Lord in many places around the world. And I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to put that out because it's encouraging to outlive ourselves and do this. So thank you for walking through that with me.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and so our time is up because I know you had to head out around this time. So Matthew Spandler Davison, thank you for joining us again here on this talk.
Time.
And
I look forward to the next time.
Yeah, and I'll try not to be 15 minutes late again on the next time. So I do apologize again, but God bless you and your work with Church in Hard Places. We'll be in touch again soon.
Great. Appreciate it. Good chat with you again, Joseph.